Welcome back to the virtual curbside. We're fortunate this month to be talking to Tara DuPont, a delightful neonatologist with a particular interest in newborn follow-up. And it turns out that we do a lot of newborn follow-up too. And so it's nice to be able to collaborate about this. Welcome back, Tara.
Thanks for having me.
You want to talk about your disclosures again?
I will. I was the site PI for a study funded by Pfizer. The study concluded about 18 months ago, but I'm still required to report the disclosure.
Perfect. We want to talk about nutrition this week because nutrition is a big deal. And one of the things I think we forget is that a fetus is different from a baby. And a lot of these precious children that you take care of in the NICU are somewhere in a gray area between fetus and infant, and a combination of both where they are in terms of development and what they've experienced makes all of this a bigger challenge. So I'm sure you'll sort this all out for us by the end of the episode.
I'll try.
So talk to us a little bit, because I think there's some of the things that are foundational for us that we need to contextualize. One of those being, what do growth curves mean in NICU graduate? How is growth monitoring particular to this population? And what are some of the challenges? Let's start with growth curves and what do we do with them?
Yeah. In our NICU, we use a growth curve that was developed off of healthy fetuses, actually. And so it's based on ultrasound data of healthy fetuses and their growth trajectory. So in the NICU, we're trying to mimic what the placenta should be doing. As you might expect, we are not very good at it. Far better than we used to be, but we are no substitute for a highly functional placenta.
What's
So,
the name of that growth curve?
the Fenton growth. Fenton is the one
Benton growth
we
curve.
use.
Okay. All
Yeah.
right.
So we're not quite good substitutes for that. So in the NICU, our diets are designed to try and emulate what the placenta is doing. So we pay really close attention to how much protein we're giving, how much carbohydrate we're giving, all of the micronutrients in there. Iron is a hot topic right now. Learning the more iron we substitute probably improves neurodevelopmental outcomes a little bit. Vitamin D is another one. So we're substituting high levels and we're monitoring electrolytes and vitamin levels periodically, usually every 2 to 4 weeks. We're checking those values to make sure that we are supplying babies with proper nutrition. Often we wind up giving extra protein to babies as they get a little bigger because we found that that helps improve length. And length is key for overcoming or for helping with lung disease. The more you grow, the more,
Oh, that's interesting.
yeah. The more you grow in length, it seems like the better the lungs do.
Is that a lung capacity issue, or is it
They
just
think it might be. It's still kind of in its infancy, and a lot of this is from like retrospective or collaborative databases. It's not necessarily, it's not super rigid, but there does seem to be a correlation between improved respiratory status with improved length. So it's something we
fascinating?
focus on a lot in the NICU. Yeah. Additionally, we know that we often produce, and it's also interesting, it's more common in females than males. We tend to be good at putting weight on them, but we're not as good as putting length on them. So we often produce more round babies, a
Mhm.
little shorter in stature and wider in
And
weight.
what should our expectations be about catch-up growth, timing, and ultimate catch-up?
Yeah, I tell families when we discharge babies, there's two things that we can do on baby's actual birthday, and that is our vaccination schedule and their birthday party.
Mhm. Mhm.
Everything else really needs to be corrected. And when I think about age correction, something that helps me know how long to correct for is I think of how much prematurity has contributed to that baby's total life. So if you have a baby that was born at 25 weeks, they're born 15 weeks early, and they are 1 year old, 52 weeks, prematurity at that point in time is about 25% of their total life. So prematurity accounts for a huge percent of their life. Now you take a 34-weeker, okay, so born 6 weeks early, and now they're 1 year old. That prematurity accounts for a much smaller part of their life. So our 25-weekers, we're going to need to give them a little grace with their correction for longer. Typically, we say 2 years. Some people say 3 years. I can tell you in our developmental testing that we do for studies, some of our studies are going out to 6 years of age. We're still correcting at 6 years of age for prematurity. I don't think a pediatrician needs to do that. Really, the first 2 to 3 years, and the less premature you are, the shorter you can probably account for.
Is that for both growth and development?
It's for both growth and
Okay,
development. Yep.
interesting.
Yeah.
What point do we say that the growth catch-up is just not going to happen and that we should do, it's not going to happen naturally, that we need to work them up for growth problems?
Yeah, I would say it probably depends on your starting point as well. And so if you have like a 32-weeker that was born at 600 grams, it's going to take a long time for that kid to catch up. And you don't want to rush it too much because we're at this. Nutrition is so hard because we know that if we can achieve catch-up growth, we're going to improve neurodevelopmental outcomes. But there's a flip side to it, which is we're going to increase the risk of metabolic syndrome later on in life. So if we have too much catch-up growth, we're putting babies at risk for hypertension, diabetes, and high dyslipidemia. All of those problems can occur with too much catch-up growth. So again, I joke, we just have to be perfect.
How do you take a more measured approach to that?
I think correcting for gestational age and knowing that sometimes you are going to need to supplement. One of my perhaps criticisms of our post-discharge care is I wish every single one of these babies had access to a dietitian. In follow-up clinic, or at least our neonatal follow-up clinic, we do not have access to a dietitian right now. I can refer a baby to a dietitian just like you guys can. But when we think about growth and development, it's nutrition all the way. And having someone specialized in that is key.
And the first several months of life, we probably have more control over that than any other time in a child's life.
Definitely, definitely. What's also interesting, and this is where it gets really rough, is that we don't have good data on what kind of diet these kids need post-discharge. There was a study years ago showing that when it came to formula, a transitional formula, so your Infocare and NeoSure, did seem to provide better development, both neurodevelopment and growth development. But more contemporary studies have not replicated those same findings, and which I found intriguing. And and an article I recently read said it's one of those things where NICU culture is to send babies home on these supplemental formulas, but it really has not been officially validated in research studies. Now, the fact that almost every NICU sends a baby home on a transitional formula, I think does speak to the fact that there is some benefit to that. I do recommend it for the kids that I see in follow-up clinic using those transitional formulas until about 1 year corrected age. Having said that, though, it is not necessarily validated in the literature. Now, breast milk is even more complicated.
I was going to say, because breast milk is not easily fortifiable in its natural state.
It's not. And what's interesting, and I am going to say I have a little bit of a bias here, and it's a bias because of the literature that I've read. And I just reviewed an article too, and I was pleased to see that they agreed with me. Adding that scoop of formula to a bottle actually does not provide a ton of extra nutrition. On top of that, when you add that scoop of formula to the breast milk starts to digest that formula because breast milk is a living substance.
Oh, right.
You're actually increasing the osmolality, you're increasing the number of particles in the milk, and you're also kind of damaging the breast milk with the formula. So the method that I prefer would be 2 bottles of Infocare or NeoSure and just keep the breast milk pure. Let moms directly breastfeed. Let them have the straight breast milk because it's a little more potent when you give it that way. And then when you give the bottle, you know that you're giving the full amount of protein in that bottle and the full amount of iron that's in there, and vitamin D, all of those little nutrients.
And that's the thing. One of the things I think, especially early in the operation, is trying to figure out how much a baby is getting at the breast. And it turns out you know something about this.
I do. When I was in New Mexico, we did a study looking at test weights. So weighing a baby before and after feeding. Now, our study was done in the hospital. It was always controversial. And some people criticized test weights, saying that they didn't work, and then others thought that they worked. So
Test weight being weighing the baby before and after
weighing the
feeding.
baby before and after, correct. Yeah, yeah. So my fellow and I were like, well, let's power a study and let's do it. It's not that hard. And it actually wasn't that hard. It
All
took
right.
us about 6 months to enroll enough babies. We used babies in the NICU, and we only did gavage feeds. Now, I'll tell you that we got some criticism for only doing gavage feeds, but that was because I wanted to know exactly how much was into the stomach. Anytime you bottle feed, I feel like there's always a little bit of dribble or a little loss. So perhaps in terms of a pragmatic study, it wasn't the most pragmatic, because at home you're going to be, direct breastfeeding, you're going
Right.
to get some dribble there. But we found that using a very specific technique resulted in very accurate results. However, when we tried to do a less specific technique, so one where the monitor leads were left on the baby and they were taped to the side of the scale to kind of remove their weight, even just that little difference threw the weights off. So we lost correlation with it. So the leads actually had to be removed from the monitor and coiled on the baby's chest when the baby was swaddled. And then we had a much better prediction of what was put in.
So if the baby is wearing the same thing before and after, including the diaper,
Yep.
so that any body waste that was inside before is now still weighed, that's a reasonable way to estimate.
Exactly. And that's the key point. If it was on the baby beforehand, it needs to be on after. And I think that's where some people mess up test weights a little bit. You can't think of it as actually weighing the baby. You're just trying to get an idea of
Right.
what the consumption was. The weight may be totally off.
The baby is like the tear weight, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Zero the scale for the baby,
Right.
and measure what's in the baby.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I reviewed an article not too long ago that looked at using it as an outpatient as well. And they did find some good correlation between it.
Yeah,
as an outpatient.
for better or for worse, we rely on it in clinic because we have nothing else
Yeah.
to do. And I think it at least gives us a ballpark figure. What about things like reflux and babies who you wonder if they may be aspirating?
I think that's a great question, and something we probably don't recognize enough. Now, reflux is common, very common. I used to tell families that it usually resolved around 1 year of age. I still think that that's mostly true, but you can expect a good amount of, spit up after a baby goes home. I would say 1 year of age because of gravity and strength. So around 1 year, babies tend to be a little bit more upright, and they tend to be a little bit stronger and able to hold that food down. In the NICU, we do everything we can to make it hard for a preterm baby. So their lower esophageal sphincter is already weak from being preterm. And then we put a life-saving NG or OG tube down to stent that lower
prop it open.
esophageal sphincter
A stent.
open, to keep it open all the time. And then we take it out and we wonder why they're spitting up. Well, it's because it hasn't had time to strengthen, and it was, weak to begin with, and we're keeping it open.
Yeah.
My anecdotal story on this one is I would tell families 1 year of age, and then my best friend had a 32 weeker, well-grown 32 weeker, and she was still having significant reflux at about 18 months of age that I realized when I was out to lunch with them, and she'd eat and it'd just come right back up. Again, she was growing well, she was doing well, so there wasn't a whole lot of concern, but I think reflux can happen for a lot longer than we tend to warn parents about. Silent aspiration is another story, and we don't know what to do about that. Sometimes I think that if we look for it, we find it. When we do swallow studies in the NICU, we see a lot of silent aspiration, and I'm not sure we know exactly what to do about that. If you have a baby, though, that's not weaning off of oxygen very well and does seem to have some struggles with feeding, I would be pretty quick to refer that baby to speech or a feeding clinic for a swallow evaluation.
That's helpful. You touched on micronutrients a minute ago, but let's go back over them. What are the ones that are going to be most important that we're staying on top of?
I would say iron is probably the king right now.
And you said we may be underestimating.
We're probably underestimating iron. When we look at, remember that your third trimester is when babies steal all iron from their mom, and that's supposed to
Right.
last them, for their first 6 months. You're born at 25 weeks, you miss out on all of that, right? You're born at, 32 weeks, you miss out on about half of that, right? So we in the NICU try to supplement, and we're sometimes giving 10 to 12 milligrams per kilo of iron just to try and get close to maintaining what the baby needs. Literature now is suggesting as an outpatient, they probably need at least 4 milligrams. And it seems like that number is just creeping upward. So it wouldn't surprise me if it started to get closer to 6 milligrams per kilo.
Fascinating.
And that one is important for brain growth. Like when we look at neurodevelopment, there does appear to be a direct correlation between iron supplementation and neurodevelopment.
Yeah, one of the take homes for me too, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if we even look at a late preterm baby, they've still missed out on a significant portion of that iron loading. And we probably are underserving them if we're not giving them a little iron.
Yes, yes.
And over how long a period do we need to be doing that?
I would say at minimum 6 months,
Okay.
probably a little bit longer.
Any special needs for vitamin D or calcium
Yeah,
or any other micronutrients?
vitamin D for sure. 400 international units is still the recommendation. A lot of times when we check vitamin D levels in the NICU, we're going 800 to sometimes even 1,000 milligrams to try and avoid vitamin D deficiency. So higher vitamin D. Calcium is usually adequate with just breast milk.
Okay. How much and how often should we be monitoring for deficiencies? I mean, should I be testing?
In the NICU, we check every 2 to 4 weeks. I would say if your baby happened to be discharged home at 35 weeks, which is fairly uncommon, but if they happen to be discharged at 35 weeks, I probably would check a set of nutrition labs, which would be like a renal function panel. And then I would add an alkaline phosphatase onto that and a phosphorus onto it just to make sure that those values are reasonable. If you're really interested, you could do a vitamin D also. But if a baby is discharged post-term and their values have looked good while they're in the NICU, I don't think there's really any reason to check.
Okay. Any other red flags we ought to be watching for? We've talked about not growing. Other red flags about nutrition that we should be thinking more carefully about?
I think I would remind people that the brain growth depends on nutrition. So, myelination of the brain occurs predominantly in that third trimester. And myelin is dependent on iron and it's dependent on cholesterol. So, you really need reasonable quantities of those nutrients to help those brain connections achieve full potential.
What happens in the NICU is fascinating the more I reflect on it, because what you're doing is you're replacing sort of this perfectly constructed parenteral nutrition system and with an enteral nutrition system, but you can't really, it would be a mistake, I would think, to try to duplicate a parenteral system because you have organ systems switched on that weren't there before. The enteral system is switched on and relies on some sort of maintenance. So boy, hats off to you guys. That's a tough
Yeah.
job.
Nutrition is one of the biggest parts of our job. One more thing that early on should be a consideration would be babies that have had necrotizing enterocolitis or just preterm babies. If you have a baby that was feeding well orally and then suddenly does not want to eat, your very preterm babies are at risk for NEC up to about 50 weeks post-conceptual age. So that theoretically could be in the pediatrician's office. One of the worst cases of NEC that I have seen, it was in a baby that had been home for 2 weeks and stopped eating, became hypothermic, and had a pretty severe case of necrotizing enterocolitis coming back to the NICU for another lengthy stay.
Terrifying.
Yep.
So, among other things, it's also important for us to remember, as you alluded to early on, is that our friends, the dietitians, can also be a huge resource. Working outside our usual comfort zone, again, it's no sign of weakness to collaborate with someone who makes this their particular interest.
I agree completely.
Anything else you want to share?
If you wanted to, we could, tube feeds on there a little bit. Do you want to discuss that a bit?
Yeah, please, let's do.
Okay. This one I studied also.
Okay, good. Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, let's
Okay.
talk a little bit about tube feeds.
So we're seeing more and more babies discharged home with tube feedings. And there's two ways that we can provide that. One is through a gastrostomy tube, which is a surgically placed tube into the stomach. Second way is through a home NG tube, where we teach families how to put the home NG tube in. And I have been fascinated with the literature surrounding home NG tube feedings. We recently looked at neurodevelopmental outcomes, so Bailey 3 scores at 2 years of age for kids that we send home with tube feedings. And we found that the kids we send home with NG feeds, most of them get to full oral feeds and don't need the tube anymore around 9 months of age. That's about 2/3 the babies that we send home with the NG feeds. And those kids have comparable neurodevelopmental outcomes to the babies we send home on full oral feeds. So there's really seemingly no increased risk for adverse neurodevelopmental outcomes by sending a baby home on an NG feed. Now, conversely, when we looked at the babies that we send home with G tubes, they actually had significantly lower Bailey scores. And so our first thought was they're very different populations. And I think that is ultimately true. But when we looked at the demographic information on those kids, we actually found that the babies who were sent home with NG feeds were a lower birth weight, lower gestational age, had higher grade IVH, and had more HIE. So on paper, from a diagnosis standpoint, it looked like the babies sent home on NG feeds were worse. Now, I'm not convinced that that's true. I think that we somehow managed to decide whether a baby should have an NG or a G tube based on something that we just put together in the NICU through our teamwork and shared decision making with the family. Because babies who get G tubes, the majority of them were still using their G tube at 2 years of age. Many of them were not on full oral feeds. About a third were on full oral feeds. So I think we are choosing the population correctly. It's just fascinating that it's unclear why we're choosing the population correctly.
Ooh, well, that's something that deserves a lot more scrutiny, doesn't it?
Doesn't it? Yes, it does. But take home message for
That's not
that.
intuitive.
It's not intuitive. And I think the take home message is that babies sent home on NG feeds often do quite well. And I think that's because they go from being in the NICU where they have multiple feeders throughout the day to having a very consistent set of feeders. That's my opinion on why I think they do better, because we don't actually know.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sure there will be questions. Please feel free to send your questions to questions@vcurb.com, and we'll talk about that. This is just a rich area for thinking about, isn't it?
It is.
All right, Tara, thanks for sharing your time and your expertise. Are you willing to come back and talk some more next week?
Definitely.
We'll count on it. And again, send your questions to questions@vcurb.com, and we'll talk to you again next week.